talk Russia. Again, you've got that red hash where the Russians plan to stop. The orange and, excuse me, the red is natural gas pipelines, and the green is oil pipelines. Now, oil and agriculture are expressly not covered in the sanctions that have put on Russia to date, but insurers are refusing to cover ships operating in the northern half of the Black Sea, and ship captains are refusing to dock at St. Petersburg. So we have a de facto global sanction on Russian agricultural exports already. Now, Russian ports are not sufficiently deep to take full ocean-going tankers or cargo vessels. It's relatively small, the size of vessels that can dock. So even if ship captains and insurers allowed it, and even if the sanctions don't cover these sectors in the future, they will still need to reload somewhere else. So the degree that things have to go perfectly right for Russian agriculture to continue to play a global role just is not going to happen this year. The general outrage is so high, and the insurers are so hostile to the very concept of picking up or even sailing into Russian ports that you should count on most Russian output being locked up. Now, that might loosen in a few places, but you should now count on that being the norm. About the only single spot where there may be an exception is Turkey could use its navy to escort vessels in and out of the Russian Black Sea ports and offer sovereign indemnification insurance for the vessels in order to supply itself and maybe a handful of countries in the Middle East that it would like to influence. But that is really the only player here that has the interest and the capability to do anything. Everything else is going to be locked down. Any other exports from Russia must be by rail, and the Russian rail system is already maxed out. So any sort of increases are going to be very incremental. In addition to all those problems, the Russians have another one. All these pipelines, they're all going to get shut down or blown up. And all of the exports that used to go out are going to back up in the pipeline system until you reach the wellheads, and the Russians are going to have to shut production down. And a quirk of the Russian geography, whether it's weather or the permafrost, suggests that production will be offline for a minimum of several years, if not permanently. We've seen this before. We saw this in the collapse of the Soviet system, where they had a lot more petroleum engineers in order to shut things down safely. That is not the case today. Most foreigners are out already, and the Russians are going to have to do them themselves, and they have proven time and time again that technically they do not have the skill set to do this well. So all in all, we're talking about roughly 4 million barrels of crude daily falling offline within the next 2 to 3 months. You should consider that it's going to be offline permanently. And that 4 million barrels per day is actually not as bad as it sounds, because Russia is also the world's second largest exporter of refined oil products. It exports about 2.5, 3 million barrels per day based on who's doing the math. Almost all of that comes from the ports that are already effectively shut down. So Russia will probably fill up all of its storage for crude and for refined oil products this month. And very soon thereafter, they're going to have to shut everything down. Now, high energy prices obviously means higher diesel and bunker fuel prices, which means higher agricultural prices. And that's before you get into fertilizer, which we will get to later in this presentation. But Russian exports are now functionally limited to rail, and even within that, functionally limited to their existing pre-war rail customers. They do not have the rolling stock. They do not have the capacity to add more customers above what they're already doing for rail. The system is rickety. It's not sufficiently maintained. It frequently browns and blacks out. Again, Turkey is probably the only exception to that. All right, let's talk crops. This is 30% of global wheat. All the dark browns are where most of the world's wheat exports come from. Ukraine and Russia have always been the fourth and fifth for Ukraine and second or first for Russia in terms of their role in global systems. Corn, it's a Ukraine story. Ukraine is the only large-scale corn exporter in the Eastern Hemisphere. It's primarily used for animal feed. And then, of course, sunflower oil, which is the preferred cooking oil for this part of the world. But as we will see, just because most countries don't use sunflower oil, you remove that from the market, And anyone else who uses cooking oil, which is everyone, has to juggle through a supply reshuffling because a large part of the world is still going to need it. They're going to have to use something else. So these three products are what is driving most of what's going on in agriculture from a first order effect, but there's definitely some second order effects. We'll talk about those as we go. So first, Ukraine, because it's a little bit simpler. The orange is where I'm worried in the short term. We know, because of Ukraine falling off the map and Russia being severely curtailed, we know we're going to have wildly insufficient food production globally this year, just from the first order effects. That is going to affect different countries differently on a different time frame. The countries that are in orange are all Middle Eastern, and all of them get the vast majority of their food imports from Ukraine plus Russia. They now simply will not have what they need. In 2010, which was the last time we had any sort of meaningful disruption out of this space, wheat prices in the Middle East tripled. That generated, among other things, the Arab Spring. We are looking at a total disruption this year at least 6 times as large as what we had in 2010. And again, that assumes nothing else goes wrong. That assumes just first order effects. Now, of these 3 categories, wheat is by far the most important, because there is not a substitute for it, and it is almost exclusively for human consumption. When you're talking about corn, you're talking about something that is primarily used as animal fodder, not exclusively, but primarily. So if that were to vanish, obviously there would be huge impact on prices, but it's not going to generate the sort of famine and instability effect that a shortage of wheat will. And as depressing as these 3 charts are in terms of who suffers the most, I am most concerned, right? You know what, before I go on here, take a look at that top right one, the seed oil. You'll notice that the single largest category is India. We're already seeing follow-on effects, second order effects in South Asia from the disruptions that are coming out of Ukraine, even though we're not technically in shortage yet. This is not the season when the Ukrainians and the Russians are normally exporting things. But in anticipation, we're already seeing a lot of panic buying in South Asia, and we're only going to see that intensify over the course of the next several months when it becomes obvious just how much damage the Ukrainian sector is going to feel. Here's Russia. The Russians really don't play in corn, so it's primarily a seed oil and a wheat issue. Once again, a lot of orange. When we think of the Arab Spring, we think primarily of Egypt, which is one of the world's largest wheat importers, but I would underline that Iran and Turkey are not in significantly better positions. Yes, they do grow a larger percentage of their wheat themselves for this domestic consumption, but in terms of just the raw exposure, you remove Russia from the market, and it's very difficult to see these 2 countries continuing. I am more worried about Turkey than I am with Iran. Iran already gets the majority of the Russian and their Kazakh wheat by rail. That's just the infrastructure. That does not play true for Turkey. Turkey is much more dependent upon seaborne exports, which is one of the reasons why I think that we might see some sovereign indemnification. Now, within Russia, it's not that Russia is going to disappear from the market like Ukraine, but it's going to shrink substantially, catastrophically, as both a producer and an exporter. The production is already extremely inefficient. Of their roughly 140 million acres of agricultural land, 63% of that is controlled by one of only 35,000 farms. Russia is far more vertically integrated in this space than any other country in the world. And those enterprise farms provide almost all, somewhere upwards of 85 to 90% of total exports.